The cage opened without a sound, and that was the first thing Maravas noticed was wrong. She had expected metal, a clang, a hiss of hydraulics, something mechanical and honest about what it was doing to her. Instead, the wall of her cell simply stopped existing, folding into a shimmer of static and then into nothing, and the smell of a forest rolled in to replace the recycled air she'd been breathing for 6 days. Pine. Wet stone. Something colder underneath, like the air before snow. "Walk," said the voice. It came from everywhere and nowhere, translated a half-second late so that the word arrived stretched and slightly wrong, as if the speaker had learned English from a recording played underwater. "You have been selected. You will walk." Mara did not walk. She stood in the doorway of her cell and looked out at a forest that had no business existing inside a spacecraft, if that was even what this was, and she made herself breathe slowly, the way she'd been taught a long time ago, in a different life, by a man who used to make her carry a pack up mountains until her shoulders bled. "Assess before you move," he used to say. "The ones who die first are the ones who move first." So she stood, and she looked. The trees were real, or real enough, bark rough under a light that came from no visible sun. A canopy so tall it swallowed the ceiling of wherever this was, if there was a ceiling at all. 50 meters out, a shape moved between two trunks, tall and gray and jointed wrong, and Mara's stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with fear of falling. It watched her. She watched it back. "You have 1 hour," the voice said. "Then the hunt begins. Run far. Run well. It is more interesting for everyone." The static wall did not reform behind her. She understood distantly that this was intentional. They wanted her to see that she could go back and choose not to, because staying in the cage was its own kind of death, just a slower and more boring one. Mara stepped out into the trees. She did not run. 6 days earlier, she had been 11 kilometers into a solo backcountry trip in the Bitterroots, checking a snare line she didn't need, old habit, the kind you don't unlearn even after the reason for it is gone. When the light came down through the canopy like something had opened a hole in the sky, she remembered heat without pain. She remembered the trees tilting sideways. She did not remember the 6 days between that moment and waking up in a cell with smooth gray walls and no door, only a woman's voice. No, not a woman's, just something rendered close enough to a woman's that her brain filled the rest in, explaining, almost gently, that she had been chosen. Chosen for what, it did not say, not then. It only asked her questions. How fast could she run a mile? Had she ever gone without food for more than a day? Did she feel more comfortable in open ground or in cover? She had answered some of them honestly and lied about the rest, though she couldn't have said why, except that some old, animal part of her understood that the truth was a kind of currency here, and currency was for spending carefully. Now she understood what she'd been chosen for. She was the entertainment. They called themselves the Kelvith, though the translation was approximate. The word carried an implication of those who take the long view, which Mara would come to find almost funny later, in the specific way that things become funny only after you've survived them. There were 4 hunters assigned to her. She learned their names, or their names as the translator rendered them, over the following hours, not because they told her, but because they said them to each other, and sound carries strangely under an artificial canopy that has no wind of its own. Threll was the one who had watched her from between the trunks. He was the biggest, nearly 9 feet if he stood fully upright, though he mostly didn't. He moved in a low crouching lope that ate ground fast, and Mara clocked his gait within the first 10 minutes of watching him from cover and understood 2 things. That he was built for speed over open terrain, and that he was not built for tight turns. Sannik was smaller, faster in short bursts, and carried something that might have been a weapon or might have been a recording device. She couldn't tell and didn't want to find out by testing it. The other 2 she never got names for. She thought of them, privately, as 3 and 4, and treated them as the least of her problems, because a hunting party's real danger is never its number of members. It's whoever's actually good. She had learned that a long time ago too. Not from a man with a mountain pack. From somewhere else. Somewhere she tried not to think about because thinking about it now, in a forest built to kill her, felt like waking an old injury. The hour of grace ended with no bell, no signal, just a change in the quality of the silence, the way a held breath changes when it's finally released. Mara felt it more than heard it. She was already 300 meters from the release point by then, already off the obvious game trail that any prey animal with a brain would have avoided and any predator would have checked first, already doing the thing that the voice in the cell had not expected her to do. She was not running away. She was mapping. In the first hour, while the Kelvith assumed she was cowering somewhere counting down her own execution, Mara moved in a slow, deliberate spiral, orienting by the angle of the false sun and the slope of the ground, noting where the trees thinned, where the undergrowth thickened enough to hide a body, where the ground dropped into what looked like a dry streambed cutting east to west through the whole enclosure. She found the walls, not walls exactly, but a shimmer at the tree line, the same static that had opened her cell, marking the edge of wherever this arena actually was. 2 kilometers, she guessed, maybe 2.5, roughly circular. A closed system. No way out, which meant the only variable in this equation that she could actually control was inside. She thought of her father, though she hadn't let herself think of him in years. The terrain doesn't care whether you're the fastest thing in it. The terrain only cares whether you understand it better than the thing trying to eat you. He'd said that to her the summer she turned 16. The summer everything about their life together had still been about mountains and snares and long silences on ridgelines, before it became about something much worse. She pushed the memory back down where it lived and kept moving. By the second hour, she had 4 sites marked in her head, unmarked on the ground. She was careful about that, careful not to leave sign a predator could read the way she was reading theirs. A collapsed log over the streambed, hollow enough to crawl through, narrow enough that Threll's shoulders would never fit. A stand of young trees, dense as a wall, where anything moving fast would have to slow down or crash. A slope where loose stone gave way to a 20-foot drop that wasn't visible until you were standing at the top of it. And water. A spring, cold and clean, bubbling up at the base of a rock face on the far side of the enclosure, which told her something important. Whatever this place was, it wasn't just a stage set. It had to sustain itself at least a little, which meant it had rules, and rules could be learned. By the third hour, she caught her first real look at Sennik, moving fast along the streambed 40 meters below her position, head low, scanning. He was tracking. Not randomly searching, actually tracking, reading broken twigs and disturbed leaf litter the way a person might read a book. That was the moment Mara understood something the voice in the cell had not told her and probably didn't think she needed to know. They were good at this. They had done it before. Many times. And every single time their prey had run. She let Sennik find sign of her. Carefully, deliberately, a partial boot print pressed into soft mud at the streambed's edge, angled to suggest she'd crossed there and continued east, toward open ground and away from the collapsed log she actually intended to use. It cost her 20 minutes of doubling back through water to hide her real trail, cold to the knee, moving slow enough that the current wouldn't kick up mud downstream where he'd see it. He took the bait within the hour. She watched him from cover, 40 meters up a slope, as he crouched at the print, ran something over it that pulsed a faint blue light, and then set off east at a pace that ate distance the way water eats a drop of ink. Mara did not move yet. She watched a while longer, because the print alone hadn't told her the thing she actually needed to know, which was whether the Kelvith hunted as a coordinated unit or as 4 individuals competing for the same prize. A long 5 minutes answered that. Threll appeared from the north, cutting toward Sennik's position at an angle that suggested he'd seen the same false trail and was moving to flank it rather than follow it directly. Coordinated, then, which was worse in some ways and better in others. Worse because it meant less opportunity to isolate one of them. Better because a coordinated group has a rhythm, and a rhythm, once understood, can be exploited. She waited until both of them were committed east before she moved, low and quiet, back toward the collapsed log at the streambed. The rest of the first day passed in that rhythm, small movements, small tests, small lies laid down in mud and broken branches. She never went further than she needed to. She never ran in a straight line long enough for anything to build speed against her. Every time she crossed open ground, she crossed it at an angle that put obstacles between herself and wherever a hunter might be watching from. By the time the false sun began to dim, she assumed it was engineered to dim, the same way everything else here seemed engineered to look natural without being natural. She had confirmed something that mattered more than any single piece of terrain. The Kelvith were fast. Faster than her by a wide margin in the open over any real distance. But they had never once, not in the entire day, had to think. Every move she'd watched them make was reactive. Chase the sign, follow the print, converge on the sound. Nothing anticipatory. Nothing that suggested they'd considered what she might be doing 3 moves ahead rather than 1 behind. It was the hunting style of something that had never needed anything more sophisticated, because everything they had ever hunted before had done exactly what prey animals do. It had run, in a straight line, away from the thing chasing it. Mara found the collapsed log as the light dimmed to something like dusk, crawled inside it, and allowed herself, for the first time in 6 days, something close to a plan. She heard Threll's voice before she saw him. A low series of clicks and rolling vowels that the translator, still active somewhere on or near her, rendered as fragments a half-beat behind. Gone quiet too long. They always go quiet before they break. Small ones break faster. She lay still inside the log, breathing through her mouth to keep the sound of it small, and understood that he meant her. That whatever species he'd hunted before, whatever pattern he'd learned to expect, involved a period of frantic flight followed by a collapse into stillness, prey exhausting itself and then simply waiting, paralyzed, for the end. He was narrating a script he assumed she was already inside. She was not inside it. She was inside a log, resting deliberately the way a person rests before a long climb. Not because she was afraid to move, but because moving without resting was how people got themselves killed on the 3rd day of something that should have taken one. When Threll's footsteps faded east, back toward wherever Sennik and the other 2 were regrouping, Mara allowed herself to sleep for exactly 90 minutes, timed by counting her own pulse against a rhythm she trained into herself years ago, on a mountain. With a father who was gone now and a childhood she rarely let herself remember whole. She woke when the 90 minutes ended, not because anything had made a sound, but because she had trained her body to wake, and she moved on. The 2nd day was when she started building. Not a shelter, she wasn't planning to stay anywhere long enough to need one, but something closer to a series of small, ugly, effective problems, placed exactly where she'd calculated the Kelvith's search pattern would eventually bring them. At the loose stone slope, she widened the drop with her hands and a flat rock, prying loose material away from the lip until the ground looked solid but wasn't, until a body moving at speed across it would find nothing beneath its next step but 20 feet of air. At the dense stand of young trees, she cut low branches with a sharpened stone flake. Brutal, slow work that tore the skin off 2 of her knuckles, and wedged them at ankle height, angled outward, invisible until you were already moving through them at a run. At the spring, she did nothing at all because she understood something about water that she suspected the Kelvith, coming from wherever they came from, might not. That thirst makes anything, predator or prey, careless, and that if this hunt ran long enough, eventually even the hunters would need to drink from a source they hadn't thought to guard. By the middle of the 2nd day, she had turned roughly a 1/3 of the enclosure into a space that looked exactly like the rest of it and behaved nothing like the rest of it, and she had done all of it without the Kelvith noticing because they were not looking at the ground the way she was. They were looking for her. She was looking at everything else. There was a particular kind of exhaustion in the work that she'd forgotten existed. Not the burning lung exhaustion of flight, but the slower, deeper tiredness of a body doing patient, repetitive labor with imperfect tools. Her palms blistered and split against stone she'd shaped into a crude blade. Her knees ached from hours spent crouched at ankle height, wedging branches into ground that fought her the whole way down. More than once she caught herself wanting to rush, to finish a trap half-built and move on to the next, and each time she made herself stop and breathe and finish it properly, because a half-built trap was worse than no trap at all. It would slow a hunter for half a second and then teach him, permanently, to watch that kind of ground more carefully. She thought, while she worked, about the difference between the 2 kinds of preparation she'd known in her life. There was the kind her father had taught her in the good years, careful and patient, checking a snare 3 times before trusting it, walking a mountains whether a full day ahead of committing to a summit. And there was the kind she taught herself in the years after, faster and colder, built not around patience but around anticipation, always knowing which door led outside, always keeping her shoes by the bed, always mapping a house the way she now found herself mapping a forest. Both kinds had kept her alive. It occurred to her, wedging the last branch into the tree stand as the light began to change overhead, that she had spent her whole life training for exactly this without ever once believing she'd need it again. By the time she finished, her hands were raw and her shirt was soaked through with sweat that had nowhere to evaporate in the still, engineered air, and she allowed herself, briefly, something that felt almost like satisfaction. Not because the traps were finished. Because for the first time since the light had come down through the canopy of a real forest 6 days ago, she felt less like something being hunted and more like something with a plan. The second night was when they nearly caught her, and it happened, as these things do, because of something she hadn't accounted for. She had misjudged the moon. Not a real moon. Whatever passed for one here. A pale wash of light that brightened as the artificial sun dimmed further, brighter than she'd expected, bright enough to throw a shadow, and she was crossing the open ground near the streambed at exactly the wrong moment, silhouetted for less than 4 seconds against the pale light on the water. It was enough. She heard Senec's cry go up behind her, sharp and rising, a sound with no ambiguity in it at all, and for the first time in 2 days Mara Voss ran. She ran the way she taught herself to run a long time ago, in circumstances she still didn't let herself think about directly, low, angled, using every piece of cover the way a swimmer uses a current, not fighting the terrain but moving with it, toward the stand of young trees she'd spent half a day preparing. Behind her, Senic was faster. She could hear it in the gap closing, in the particular quality of speed that comes from a body built for exactly this, evolved or engineered or grown in a lab for the express purpose of running something down. She didn't try to outrun him. She ran him into the trap. He hit the low branches at full speed, ankle height and invisible in the pale moonlight exactly as she'd planned, and the sound he made going down was not a sound she'd ever heard a living thing make before, high, mechanical, almost more surprise than pain, though there was pain in it too, she was fairly sure, judging by what happened next. She didn't stop to look. She was already moving past the tree stand, doubling back along a route she'd scouted and memorized on the first day specifically for this purpose. A route that put the loose stone slope between herself and whoever came next. Threll came next. She heard him a full 10 seconds before she saw him, moving fast along the ridge above her, cutting the angle the way he had against Senec's false trail on the first day, and Mara understood with a cold, clean certainty that he would reach the slope before she did if she kept her current line. So she changed it. She turned uphill instead of around, straight toward him, which was the single most counterintuitive thing a fleeing creature can do, and which was exactly why it worked. He was braced to intercept her at the bottom of the slope. He was not braced for her to appear, briefly, 20 feet above where he expected, moving fast along a goat track she'd found on the first day and told no one, obviously, because there was no one to tell. By the time he adjusted, she was already past him, and the loose stone slope was directly ahead of him instead of her. She heard it give way behind her. Not a scream this time, just a long, falling silence, followed by a sound like something heavy hitting rock from a height, followed by nothing at all. Mara did not look back. She kept moving until she reached the collapsed log, and only then, safe inside it, did she let her hands shake. By the third day, something had changed in the way the voice spoke to her. She hadn't heard it since the cell, assumed it had gone silent for the duration of the hunt, but it returned that morning, and this time it did not sound bored. 2 hunters incapacitated, it said. This is unusual. Mara said nothing. She was crouched at the edge of the spring, drinking carefully, watching the tree line, and she had learned by now that the voice did not require her participation to keep talking. It seemed, if anything, to prefer it that way. You should be running, it said. The others always run. I know, Mara said quietly, mostly to herself. Why do you not run? She thought about the question longer than she expected to. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud, even to a disembodied voice built to translate a species that saw her as sport, felt like admitting something she'd spent a long time trying not to look at directly. Because running away doesn't work, she said finally. It's never worked. Not against anything that's faster than you, and everything is faster than you eventually. Something is always faster. So you don't run away from what's chasing you. You make where you're standing more dangerous than where you're running to. There was a long silence on the other end, long enough that Mara wondered if the translation had failed, or if the concept simply didn't map onto whatever the Kelvith understood about the world. That is not how prey behaves, the voice said finally. I'm not prey, Mara said, and stood, and walked back into the trees. I never was. You just didn't know what you were looking at. Senec and Threll were gone from the hunt entirely. She never learned exactly what became of them, only that neither reappeared, and the voice's tally, when it mentioned numbers again, had dropped from 4 hunters to 2. That left 3 and 4, the ones she'd never bothered to name properly, and it was 3 who found her trail near midday on the 3rd day, moving fast and alone, which told Mara something important. They'd stopped coordinating. Fear did that, she suspected, even to something built for this. 2 of their own gone in ways that didn't fit any pattern they understood, and now each of the remaining 2 moving on instinct, unwilling to wait for the other, wanting to be the one who ended this rather than the one who watched it happen again. That made 3 dangerous in a way Threll and Sinik hadn't been. Dangerous because he was no longer thinking in patterns at all. He was simply moving toward her as fast as his body would carry him, and speed without a plan is its own kind of hazard, but it's also, if you understand it, the easiest kind to use against something. Mara let him get close. Closer than she'd let anything get since the hour of grace ended. Close enough to see the specific way his jaw worked when he ran. Close enough to hear breath moving through something that might have been lungs or might have been something stranger. She let him close the gap because the streambed was ahead of her, and the streambed, at this particular bend, ran fast and cold over stone slick with 3 days of moisture she'd been careful never to disturb. She crossed it at a dead sprint, sure-footed on stone she'd tested and memorized on the first day. 3 followed without slowing, because slowing was not something his body understood how to do when prey was this close, and his feet went out from under him on stone that had never once, in 3 days, held a footprint she'd needed to hide. He did not go down hard. He went down loud, and by the time he'd recovered his footing, Mara was gone. Deep into the trees stand on the far bank, and the gap between them, for the first time in the entire hunt, had reversed. She was ahead. She was faster now. Not because her legs had gotten any longer, but because he was tired in a way she wasn't, chasing in a way she wasn't, thinking in a way increasingly he wasn't. She led him in a long, deliberate loop back toward the loose stone slope, and this time she didn't need to change his angle or predict his line. He was hers now, running exactly where she wanted him to run, because he had stopped seeing the terrain at all and started seeing only her. The slope took him the way it had taken Threll. For found her at the spring on the evening of the 4th day, and by then Mara understood, with total certainty, that this was the last one. For was different from the others. Smaller, quicker to hesitate, and Mara realized, watching from the tree line as 4 crouched at the water's edge and drank without checking the ground around it first. Exactly what the voice had meant, days ago, by this is unusual. For was young. Whatever passed for young among the Kelvith, this one hadn't done this before. Not really. Not without 3 older, more confident hunters to follow. Mara almost let it go. She stood in the tree line for a long moment, watching a creature drink water at the edge of a fake spring inside an artificial forest built to entertain something crueler than either of them. And she felt something she hadn't expected to feel at any point during the last 4 days, which was not triumph and was not even relief. It was recognition. She knew what it was to be the youngest, least experienced thing in a situation built by someone older and colder, a situation you hadn't chosen and didn't fully understand and were expected to survive anyway, because the alternative was worse. She knew it from a childhood she still didn't talk about, with a father who had taught her mountains and snares in the good years and something far uglier in the years after, before she'd finally understood that some people you don't run away from. You outthink. You outlast. You make the ground beneath them more dangerous than the distance between you. She had learned that lesson from a man before she ever needed it against anything with claws. The good years had lasted until she was 14. Her father had been a man who measured love in miles hiked and knots tied correctly, who woke her before dawn to check snare lines in weather that made her hands go numb, who never once told her she'd done something well but let her know it in the small, wordless ways that mattered more. An extra minute at the fire, a nod instead of a correction. Those were the years the mountains belonged to both of them. The years after belonged only to him. A layoff, then a second one. A bottle that emptied faster each month. A temper that had always run quiet turning into something that filled the house the way weather fills a valley. Impossible to avoid once it started moving. She had learned, in those years, that running from him only worked until the day it didn't, until he was faster or angrier or simply closer than the door. So she had learned something else instead. Something she never said out loud to anyone. Not even herself, until a forest built by strangers forced her to say it plainly for the first time. She had learned to make the house harder to be angry in. To be somewhere else in it before he knew he was looking for her. To let the space between them do the work her legs couldn't. She had left at 17 and never gone back, and she had told herself for a long time that she'd left the lesson behind with everything else. Standing at the edge of an alien spring, watching the youngest of her hunters drink water without checking the ground first, she understood that she never had. She had only been waiting for something worth using it on again. For looked up, their eyes met across the water, and for one long moment neither of them moved, and Mara understood that this was the choice the whole hunt had actually been building toward. Not the physical one, which she'd already solved 3 times over, but this one. Then For's hand went to something at its side, a weapon unmistakably, no longer ambiguous the way Senex had been, and the choice made itself. Mara was already moving, already down and rolling toward the cover of the rock face before the first shot cracked past where her head had been, already understanding, with the cold clarity that had kept her alive for 4 days, that recognition was a luxury she could afford only after this ended, not during it. She led 4 away from the spring, back toward the collapsed log, using the last hour of daylight the way she'd used every hour before it. Not to outrun, but to out-terrain. For was fast and For was armed, but For had also never crossed a streambed with a false trail laid 3 days deep. Had never seen a slope that looked solid and had never learned because there had been no one left to teach that the ground itself could be the thing that killed you. The log took the last of For's daylight-fueled confidence, forcing a choice between following Mara into a space too narrow for a weapon to be aimed properly and losing her entirely in the dark. For chose to follow. It was the last mistake of the hunt. The voice returned once more, after, when the enclosure had gone fully dark and Mara sat alone at the edge of the spring. The only sound in the whole artificial forest her own breathing and the distant, endless trickle of water over stone. The hunt is concluded, it said, and this time there was something in the translation that hadn't been there before. Not quite awe because Mara doubted the Kelvith had a concept that mapped cleanly onto awe, but something adjacent to it. Something like a species recalculating a very old assumption. For hunters, it said, in 4 days, this has not happened before. It'll keep happening, Mara said. If you keep doing this to us. Explain. She thought about how to say it so that something that had never needed to think past the next chase might actually understand. You picked a species that survived on a planet full of things faster and stronger than us, she said. Big cats. Wolves. Things with claws and speed we never had. We didn't survive that by being fast. We survived it by being patient and by understanding ground, and by making traps out of nothing, and by remembering that the animal chasing you is only dangerous while it's still choosing where to put its feet. Take that choice away from it and it's not a predator anymore. It's just something falling. There was a silence that stretched long enough that Mara wondered again if the connection had failed. You did not run, the voice said finally, and this time it wasn't a question. It was closer to a species filing something away, permanently, in whatever passed for its collective memory. No, Mara said. We never do. That's the part nobody ever seems to plan for. The wall of static opened behind her sometime near dawn. Not the cell wall this time, but something larger, a doorway cut into the tree line itself, leading to a corridor of the same smooth gray material she remembered from 6 days ago, before any of this began. Mara stood at the edge of it for a long moment, looking back at the forest she'd spent 4 days turning into a weapon. The streambed, the loose stone slope, the collapsed log, the spring that had, in the end, told her more about her hunters than any trail ever could. Then she walked through because staying would accomplish nothing now, and because whatever came next, she understood something the Kelvith had needed 4 dead or broken hunters and 4 days to learn for the first time in however many thousand years they'd been doing this. She was not prey. She had never been prey. She was something else, something older and stranger than fast or slow, and now, somewhere out past whatever passed for a horizon on their homeworld, that fact had a name attached to it and a face and a species that would think twice before choosing hers again. Behind her, the forest went dark, one section at a time, like something being carefully filed away. Mara Voss did not look back a second time. She had already mapped everything she needed to know about what was behind her. From here on, all that mattered was what was ahead. They released her 9 days later, on a stretch of empty highway not far from where the Bitterroots met the plains, with no explanation and no apology, only a final, brief transmission from the voice that had narrated her captivity. A transmission she would never fully explain to the investigators, or the doctors, or the sister who drove 11 hours to bring her home and didn't ask a single question the whole way back. "Your species has been noted," the voice had said, in the last moment before the light took her. "The designation has been changed." She never learned what the old designation had been. She suspected, standing on that empty highway with the smell of asphalt and pine instead of static and false spring water, that she didn't need to. Whatever word the Kelvith had once used for humanity, it would not survive the story that 4 hunters, 3 of them broken and 1 of them gone entirely, would eventually have to tell about a woman who never ran. Mara walked to the shoulder of the road and sat down in the dry grass, and for a long time she simply watched the sun. A real one, warm on her face in a way no engineered light had managed to fake, and let herself feel, for the first time in 9 days, something that wasn't calculation. Somewhere out past a horizon she would never see again, a species that had hunted for longer than her own had existed was rewriting what it understood about prey. It would not hunt her kind for sport again without remembering exactly why it had stopped. Behind her, whatever had taken her was already gone, folded back into whatever passed for a sky. Ahead of her was a road she knew, leading toward a life she still had to learn how to live again. Slowly, the way you relearn anything after the ground beneath it has changed. She stood up, brushed the dry grass from her jeans, and started walking, not because anything was chasing her, but because, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she finally wanted to see what was over the next rise. The end.